The marble conference table gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights as my sisters argued over which of them would take Dad's corner office. Their voices bounced off the glass walls of the boardroom while his body lay in a hospital freezer 3 blocks away. Evelyn was already calling the estate attorney, pacing in her crimson heels like she owned the building. Brooke leaned against the window overlooking Manhattan, snapping pictures of the skyline and the penthouse she planned to refurbish for branding events. My hands were shaking as I placed Dad's cufflinks on the table, still warm from when I'd held them goodbye, and neither of them even glanced up. They didn't notice the tear sliding down my cheek. They didn't hear my stomach twist when the lawyer cleared his throat. They didn't care that the last piece of our father hadn't even been buried. They only cared about what they could strip from him before the world realized he was gone. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Harper Lane, and I grew up believing I was part of a close-knit family. I'm 18 now, though most days I feel older, like my childhood got ripped off its hinges before I ever had a chance to step into it. Dad built Lane Freight and Supply from a single pickup truck into a national shipping empire. But at home, it was always my sisters who took center stage. Evelyn had the brains, the polished resume, the MBA. Brooke had the beauty, the influencer smile, the curated life people envied. And me? I was the kid tagging along behind them, trying to earn scraps of attention between their successes. I never told anyone how often I ate dinner alone because they were busy, how many birthdays they forgot, how many times Dad would look at me with this quiet guilt in his eyes because he knew they treated me like a shadow. I didn't complain. I didn't want to add weight to his already heavy shoulders. He'd pat my back and tell me I had heart, and at the time I didn't know that meant more than every award Evelyn brought home or every sponsorship Brooke flashed on Instagram. When Dad died, whatever thin thread connected us snapped instantly. Evelyn and Brooke turned his passing into a hostile takeover. They stopped speaking to me as a sister and started speaking to me like a nuisance. At the funeral home, they whispered behind my back about assets and positioning, not memories or grief. When the will was finally read, I sat between them at the long mahogany table, hands clasped in my lap, still tasting the hospital antiseptic on my tongue from that morning. The attorney began with the typical legal language. Evelyn straightened her blazer. Brooke smirked like she already knew she'd won. Then his voice shifted. "To my daughters, Evelyn and Brooke Lane," he said, "I leave Lane Freight and Supply valued at $31 million, along with all properties and holdings." My breath hitched, but I stayed still. I thought maybe Dad had left me something meaningful, even if it wasn't money. A letter, a message, a memory. Then the attorney slid a small black phone across the polished table toward me. "To my youngest Harper, I leave personal item number 7 Alpha." The phone's screen lit up with a faint blue countdown. 243 days. Brooke laughed so loud it echoed. "That's it." A burner phone. Evelyn didn't even wait for the lawyer to finish. Well, Dad always did say she needed to learn responsibility. Their laughter buzzed in my ears like static. That was the moment the world tilted. The moment I realized that in their eyes I wasn't just the youngest, I was disposable. I walked out of the attorney's office with a single object in my hand, no home to return to, and no sisters who cared enough to ask where I would sleep that night. Behind me, they were already talking about new management strategies and which designer should renovate the penthouse. That night, sitting in my old Toyota behind a diner on the Hudson, I stared at that black phone glowing on my dashboard. 243 days, a timer ticking toward something I couldn't understand, something Dad thought I needed, something my sisters were never meant to touch. I wrapped myself in the blanket I'd stolen from my childhood room before they locked me out and whispered into the dark, "Why did you leave me this?" Dad, I didn't know it then, but that tiny blue countdown was the fuse on everything that would come next. And when it finally hit 0, nothing about my life or my sisters would ever be the same. The birthday candles flickered against the dining room walls, casting long shadows across the tablecloth, as everyone sang my name except the 2 people I wanted to hear most. Evelyn and Brooke leaned in close to each other, whispering about a gala they were invited to, their laughter sharp enough to slice through the melody. When Dad nudged the cake toward me, I inhaled deeply and blew out all 12 flames in one breath. Before I could even lift my head, Brooke snatched the knife from my hand with a grin, saying I wasn't cutting fast enough. Evelyn rolled her eyes and took over passing slices around the table, but skipping the seat directly in front of me. A dozen plates were served, none to the girl whose birthday it was. I sat quietly folding my hands in my lap, pretending I wasn't hungry, pretending I didn't mind. It's strange how a single memory like that can echo years later, long after the candles are gone and the table is cleared. When I look back now, I see that moment for what it was, not an accident, but a pattern that had woven itself into every part of my life. Growing up the youngest in a family like mine meant learning how to disappear without anyone teaching you. My sisters were born to shine, or at least that was what everyone seemed to believe. At school functions, Evelyn dazzled teachers with her perfect grades, while Brooke charmed entire classrooms with her sparkly personality. People gravitated toward them the way moths do toward porch lights, and I was the quiet one, the one who stayed a step behind, waiting for someone to notice I existed. Dad noticed more than he let on. I used to catch him watching the three of us at dinner, his gaze lingering on the way I picked at my food long after my sisters finished theirs. He'd place a roll on my plate when no one was looking, murmuring that he knew I liked the soft middle. But even he couldn't stop the way the house tilted in my sister's direction. Their voices carried farther, their moods set the tone for every gathering, and their desires shaped the rhythm of the Lane home. There were summers when we'd spend long evenings in the backyard, and Dad would try to draw me into the conversation. But every time he opened a door for me, one of my sisters closed it. Evelyn would talk over me, shifting the topic back to her internship. Brooke would sigh loudly whenever I offered an opinion, as if my words weighed her down. Eventually, it became easier to stop trying. I learned how to make myself small in rooms that belonged to other people. It wasn't that I didn't have thoughts worth sharing, I just knew they would fall flat before they landed. Silence, at least, didn't earn ridicule. Family holidays were the worst. Christmas morning turned our house into a stage where only 2 actresses performed. When gifts were passed around, mine were always wrapped in the same plain silver paper, while theirs came with bows and ribbons that sparkled under the tree lights. I'd peel back the tape carefully each year, telling myself it didn't matter that wrapping was just paper. But paper can say a lot when everything else remains unspoken. I still remember one Thanksgiving when relatives gathered from all over. The house hummed with conversation plates clattered, and the smell of roasted turkey drifted through every room. After dinner, the adults gathered in the living room praising Evelyn's leadership skills and Brooke's growing online following. When someone finally turned to me asking what I'd been up to, Evelyn answered for me before I could open my mouth. "She likes reading," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She's simple like that." Everyone chuckled politely, and I smiled too, hoping my face didn't betray the sting behind my ribs. Over the years, moments like those layered themselves inside me like sheets of glass, transparent, silent, unbroken, but sharp. They taught me to accept crumbs, to believe that being overlooked was normal, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention drifted my way. It took a long time for me to understand that surviving is not the same as living. Dad tried to bridge the gap. He'd invite me to walk the shipping docks with him, weaving me through forklifts and shouting workers as if I belonged there. But even those afternoons came with an unspoken expiration. The moment we came home, my sisters reclaimed his attention, tugging him back into their orbit. I didn't fight it. I didn't want to be another obligation in a life already stretched thin. It wasn't until middle school that I realized the world beyond our house saw me the same way my sisters did, like a background character in someone else's movie. During a group project in 8th grade, I did all the research while my classmates took credit during the presentation. When I mentioned it quietly to the teacher afterward, she said my voice was too soft, that she couldn't tell who contributed what. The truth was simple. I didn't know how to stand up for myself because I'd never been taught that my voice deserved the space. So I carried that quietness with me like a second skin. It wrapped around me at school, at dinner tables, at social gatherings, whispering that it was safer not to expect too much. If you don't expect warmth, you can't be hurt by the cold. By the time I reached high school, I'd fully accepted my role as the invisible one. I didn't envy my sister's popularity, not really. What hurt was their assumption that my smallness validated their superiority. They treated my silence as proof that I didn't matter. There were times when Dad tried to intervene. He'd sit beside me during family meetings, offering nods of encouragement whenever I spoke, but even he couldn't control the atmosphere his two eldest daughters created. The house bent toward them always, and he knew it. Sometimes he'd look at me with a sadness I didn't understand. Then a sadness I now realize came from knowing he hadn't balanced the scales the way he meant to. The week before he died, he asked me to help him sort old files in his study. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a stack of folders, and he muttered something about needing to set things right. I didn't know what he meant at the time. I thought he was talking about budgets or backlogged shipments. I didn't know he was racing a clock that none of us could see. If I'd known, maybe I would have asked him questions I never dared to before. Maybe I would have asked why he didn't step in more often, why he let my sisters carve out so much space that I barely had room to breathe. But grief makes hindsight sharp, and by the time those questions found words, he was gone. The night after the will reading, when I lay in my car with that black phone glowing faintly on the dashboard, memories like these rolled through me one after another. Not the loud ones, the quiet ones, the ones where I sat alone at a table full of people, the ones where my voice dissolved before it reached the air, the ones where I told myself that my sisters didn't mean harm, that I should be patient, that someday things would change. But they didn't. Not until that phone vibrated for the first time, and as I stared at its blue countdown ticking steadily towards something I didn't yet understand, I realized that the past I'd spent years trying to ignore was not done with me. It was about to collide with the present in a way that would force every secret to the surface. Something was coming, something that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. And for once in my life, I wasn't sure whether I was ready. The phone vibrated so violently, it almost slid off my dashboard. The blue countdown vanished in an instant, replaced by a stark white screen with a single line of text pulsing in the dim morning light. Then a map appeared, coordinates blinking red, followed by a digital folder that opened itself without me touching anything. Dozens of files spilled across the screen. Transfer logs, emails, corporate forms bearing my father's signature and my own name beside it. My breath caught as I tapped one, and a legal document unfurled with the words, Majority Beneficiary Harper Lane. Another file followed audio this time. My father's voice filled the car, recorded but alive, telling me I had reached the age where the truth becomes your responsibility. My fingers trembled as more documents loaded each one, revealing something deeper, something impossible. I scrolled until the screen stopped on one final line, Lane Freight and Supply Protected Assets restricted to Harper Lane only. For a long moment, I couldn't tell if I was breathing or drowning. When the shock loosened its grip enough for me to think the world around me seemed to rearrange itself, every memory, every slight, every unexplained look from my father shifting into a new shape. The truth had been sitting in my hands the entire time. I just hadn't known how to read it. The files began making sense piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been scattered across years of my life. The first document I opened was dated nearly 5 years earlier, before Dad's health had declined, before the estate lawyers ever got involved. It was a trust amendment sealed under my name, something Evelyn and Brooke were never intended to see. Dad had written that a portion of the company's deepest assets should remain dormant until I turned 18. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no shared allocation, just my name spelled out clearly in his sharp handwriting. I scrolled to the next file. A financial report. At first glance, it looked like any other balance sheet, but the more I read, the more the numbers told a different story. Funds shifted quietly into protected accounts. Shipments marked supplemental operations routed through screens of corporate jargon. I recognized some of the address names from the stories Dad used to tell about the docks and the people he met there, small hints about a world beneath the company's shiny exterior. Then came the emails. The first one wasn't addressed to me directly, but it hit harder than any spoken truth. Dad had written to one of the company attorneys instructing him to keep certain shares undisclosed during the estate review. He didn't mention Evelyn or Brooke. He mentioned only the youngest, adding that she would understand the purpose, not just the power. The words stung, but not because they hurt. They stung because they cracked open something I'd buried, the belief that I had been invisible to him. I could almost hear his voice the way it used to sound on the docks, quiet, but certain, telling me I had heart, and not realizing I clung to those words more tightly than I ever admitted. What he'd kept from my sisters wasn't favoritism, it was protection. I opened another file, this one a video. My father sat at his desk, the single lamp beside him casting a soft glow across his tired face. His voice was thinner than I remembered, and his eyes carried that weary clarity I had watched deepen in his final weeks. "If you're seeing this, Harper," he said, "then you've already found what others were never meant to touch." He paused, breathing slowly. "You will feel betrayed before you feel prepared. But know this, every choice I made was because you see people, not numbers. You listen even when others talk over you. That is why the truth belongs to you." The screen froze on his face for a full second before the video ended. I sat still, gripping my knees, letting the air settle around me. It felt as though a weight I'd carried forever had shifted from my shoulders onto the floor beside me. Not gone, but finally shareable with someone, even if that someone was only the echo of my father. I clicked through more files, and each one added another thread to a tapestry I had never been allowed to see. There were records of charitable shipments disguised as regular freight, notes about relief efforts built quietly into the logistics routes, names of warehouse workers Dad trusted enough to confide in people who had helped him run programs that existed only in coded ledger entries. All of it hidden beneath the company my sisters believed was theirs. My pulse quickened as I reached a folder marked Internal Risks. Inside were summaries of conversations between my father and the board. It became clear that Evelyn and Brooke had pushed for aggressive expansions into luxury contracts, lobbying for high-end deals that would have redirected funds away from the very operations Dad considered the company's true purpose. They weren't just indifferent to his mission, they had actively resisted it. And suddenly, the will, reading the laughter, the mockery, none of it felt random anymore. It felt orchestrated. They had been prepared to inherit the shiny surface of Lane Freight and Supply, the one that made headlines and profit margins. They never suspected the real legacy existed below the surface, protected by hidden infrastructure and sealed documentation. I swallowed hard, realizing the betrayal ran deeper than I thought. Not only had they pushed me aside for years, they had pushed aside the very heart of what Dad built. And he knew it. That was why he hid the truth in a phone with a countdown only I could unlock. Why he shifted assets quietly. Why he recorded those late-night messages. Why he tested my patience, my resilience, my instinct to hold on even when it didn't make sense. The more I read, the more a different kind of energy flooded me, one I hadn't felt before. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger simmered beneath it. It was certainty. A steadiness that filled the space where self-doubt used to live. The pieces finally connected, and the world sharpened around their edges. The past hadn't been aimless cruelty, it had been preparation. But the most shocking revelation came from a document I almost missed, a short annotation buried inside a legal PDF. It was a note Dad had added to a draft of his estate plan addressed to the attorney handling the review. "Keep Evelyn and Brooke out of the second structure. They won't understand what it's built for. Harper will once the time is right. The second structure." I hadn't known what it meant until I opened one more file in the phone, a set of coordinates labeled Warehouse 12B, accompanied by an entry code. That was where the deeper truth lay. The hidden arm of the company that my sisters never realized existed. The legacy Dad had guarded for decades. The phone buzzed again. A message flashed. "You're ready. Go." I sat in my car with the morning sun creeping over the roof, lighting the cracked windshield in a warm wash of gold. My breath steadied. My heartbeat slowed. I knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same once I followed those coordinates. But I also knew I couldn't turn back. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of stepping forward. I placed my hand over the phone, closed my eyes for a moment, and let my father's last words echo through me. "You see people, Harper. That is why the truth belongs to you." When I opened my eyes again, something inside me had shifted, solidified. I started the engine. Whatever waited for me in that warehouse, whatever secrets Dad had locked away, whatever truth my sisters had been shielded from, would no longer stay buried, and the next time I saw Evelyn and Brooke, I wouldn't be the quiet shadow they used to overlook. I would be the storm coming right at them. Evelyn's voice cut through the boardroom just as I dropped the folder onto the glossy mahogany table. The thud echoed off the glass walls, stopping half the executives mid-sentence. Brooke's hand froze around her pen, her smile flickering as she noticed the document spilling like a cascade of truth across the spreadsheets she had been presenting. I pushed the speaker button on the small device I'd brought, and my father's recorded voice filled the room, steady, unmistakable, naming me as the intended successor. Chairs scraped backward. Someone gasped. Evelyn's face drained as she reached for the papers, but I slid them out of her grasp. "Don't," I said quietly, and my voice cut the air sharper than any shout. Every eye turned to me as I lifted the final page, Dad's sealed directive, and placed it between us like a verdict. If that moment felt like the ground shifting, let me pull you back long enough to understand how everything led to that crack in the earth. 2 nights earlier, I sat at my kitchen table, an old diner booth someone had thrown out now perched in my tiny rented studio, surrounded by files I had spent the entire day retrieving from the coordinates unlocked on my phone. The truth was dense, layered, and dangerous in its implications. I had clipped each page into a neat binder, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. For the first time since Dad died, I felt anchored in something real. Not love, not wealth purpose. I knew my sisters wouldn't listen privately. History proved that. I needed witnesses. I needed a room where Evelyn and Brooke couldn't bulldoze me with their practiced confidence or drown me out with their noise. The quarterly executive meeting was set for Tuesday at 9. Both my sisters would be there. Evelyn presenting operational projections, Brooke unveiling rebranding ideas. They expected applause approval control. I arrived early. I sat at the far end of the table, binder on my lap, heart steady but fierce. When the clock struck 9, the room filled with familiar chatter, the kind that floats between pretending and posturing. No one looked at me twice. I wasn't on the agenda. I never had been. When Evelyn stood at the front of the room, her blazer crisp and tailored, she began her slideshow with the same smooth voice she always used when talking down to people. Brooke clicked through graphics with that glossy confidence that made strangers think she was charming. They didn't see the storm brewing 3 chairs away. And then I stood up. The room hushed as my binder hit the table. Now in that boardroom, I watched Evelyn's composure crack in real time. Her jaw tightened, her breath shallow and visible in the tension fogging the air. She tried to speak, but my father's voice drowned her out. "Harper will understand purpose. Protect the second structure. She is the rightful steward." Brooke shook her head slowly, as though denial might undo the recording. This is manipulated," she whispered. "It has to be." But the executives recognized Dad's voice. They had worked with him for decades. They knew the cadence, the firmness, the way he paused before saying something important. No recording software could mimic that kind of humanity. The air thickened. I breathed in and stepped forward. "Dad protected the core operations of this company," I said, "the ones none of you knew existed. He built a separate network, one meant to keep the humanitarian division alive, even when the rest of the company strayed from its purpose." Evelyn scoffed, but her voice wavered. "This is absurd. There is no second structure. Lane Freight is a shipping company. That's all." I opened the binder to the first set of documents, legal filings filed quietly under my name, sealed until my 18th birthday. "Dad hid it from you," I said, "because he knew you wouldn't understand it." The CFO, Mr. Willard, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses slowly. "This signature, this is Richard's handwriting." His finger traced the ink. "And this seal, this is from our private legal counsel. This is legitimate." A murmur rippled across the room. Brooke reached for the papers again, her breath sharp. "No," she said. "No, I don't believe this. Dad wouldn't keep this from us." I looked her in the eye. He already did. The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't buckle under grief. It tightened with realization. And that's when the twist revealed itself. At first, it appeared as a single page tucked between financial statements, a list of access attempts, each line time-stamped, each one marked unauthorized. The name associated with the repeated attempts, Evelyn Lane. The room seemed to tilt. Mr. Willard frowned. These attempts began 6 months before Richard passed. I let the evidence speak for me. Evelyn lunged across the table, snatching the page. But even from where I stood, everyone could see the truth stamped across it. Her username, her access code, her failed attempts to enter sealed accounts. She didn't just know the second structure existed. She had tried to access it, tried and failed. Her breath came fast, uneven. "Those logs are fabricated," she said. "Anyone could have used my username." "No," I replied calmly. "Dad's system required biometric verification for those accounts." A beat of silence. "Your attempts were rejected because your fingerprint didn't match the required signature." The realization struck the room like a dropped chandelier. Someone sucked in a breath. Another whispered, "Oh my God." Brooke stared at her sister wide-eyed. "Evelyn, did you know about this? You told me, Dad?" She stopped the rest of her sentence, dissolving into the stillness. I watched Evelyn's composure collapse in real time. Her eyes darted, calculating exits that didn't exist. Her grip on her own narrative slipped through her fingers like sand. She opened her mouth again, but Mr. Willard raised a hand. "Miss Lane," he said, tone cool and formal, attempting unauthorized access to sealed corporate accounts is a serious violation, especially when those accounts pertain to protected operations. A ripple of disapproval shook the executives. Men and women Evelyn had commanded with ease just minutes earlier now avoided her eyes. I continued, my voice steady. "Dad didn't appoint me to spite you. He did it because he knew you were trying to take something he couldn't trust you with, something built for people, not profit." Brooke's voice trembled. "You told me Dad froze those funds because he didn't want Harper wasting them." Evelyn finally broke. I was protecting the company. You know how he was at the end, confused, emotional, making reckless decisions." The gasps were audible. She realized what she'd implied. "You're calling Dad incompetent?" I asked softly. Her face collapsed into silence. I stepped closer to the table, placing the final document, Dad's sealed directive, front and center. "This memorandum was written 3 months before he died," I said. His mind was sharp, his decisions intentional. He knew what he was doing. Brooke reached for the document with trembling fingers. As she read, her shoulders slumped. Her lips parted as she whispered almost to herself, "He chose you." A pain flickered across her eyes. Not jealousy exactly, but something older, deeper, wearing the face of regret. Evelyn looked around the room, searching for support. The executives she'd relied on a moment earlier stared back with cool neutrality. No one moved to defend her. Not one. I took a deep breath. "I'm not here to tear you down," I said quietly. "I'm here because the truth deserves to be heard, and because Dad's legacy deserves to be honored." I gathered the binder and slid it back under my arm. The company moves forward differently now. I let the silence absorb the message, let the shift settle into the bones of the room. Then I nodded once, stepped back from the table, and turned toward the door. No one stopped me. No one called after me. Behind me, chairs creaked softly as the boardroom absorbed a new reality. A reality where Evelyn's authority evaporated under her own deception, where Brooke grappled with truths she'd never bothered to question, where the room that once saw me as invisible now watched me leave with steady, undeniable power. When the door clicked shut behind me, the hallway felt impossibly quiet. For the first time in my life, I walked away, not because I was dismissed, but because I had said everything that needed saying. And the truth finally had spoken louder than they ever did. The hallway felt impossibly quiet after the boardroom door closed behind me. My footsteps echoed as I walked slow and steady down the long marble corridor. For the first time in my life, no one was trailing behind me telling me where to stand or how to disappear. My hands were still warm from the binder I'd carried, but my shoulders felt strangely light, as if something had finally shifted off them at last. Outside the building, the morning air brushed against my face, cool and honest, untouched by the tension I had left behind. I took one deep breath, and it was the first breath in years that didn't hurt. That silence became the bridge between who I had been and who I was becoming. The days that followed were not dramatic or loud. They were slow, deliberate, and surprisingly gentle. I met with the legal team appointed in my father's directive people, who had worked in the shadows waiting for the moment I stepped into the light. Together we began untangling the parts of Lane Freight the public knew from the parts my father had hidden for years. Every document we reviewed reaffirmed the truth I had felt, but never voiced I was meant to protect what he built, not merely inherit it. Reclaiming what was mine didn't come in a single, triumphant moment. It came in small actions, each one grounded in quiet dignity. The first was moving out of the cramped studio apartment I had been living in since my sisters locked me out of the family home. I found an old townhouse my father once invested in, but never renovated a place that had good bones and sunlight in every window. It needed work, yes, but as I scrubbed the floors and peeled away faded wallpaper, I felt something inside me settling. Healing sometimes looks like cleaning a room no one else bothered to care about. Each nail I hammered, each wall I repainted, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The house didn't feel like luxury. It felt like opportunity, a space built not from entitlement, but from effort. For the first time, the walls didn't echo with comparisons or criticisms. They were blank, waiting, willing to be transformed. My sisters stayed quiet in the weeks that followed. There were no angry calls, no attempts to regain control. Instead, there were 2 short messages, one from Brooke, one from Evelyn, both simple, both surprising. Brooke apologized first. Not a grand apology, just a soft acknowledgement that she hadn't seen me clearly. Evelyn's message came later. There was no apology in it, only a recognition that the truth had unsettled her in ways she didn't know how to admit publicly. I didn't reply, not out of resentment, but out of self-preservation. Boundaries don't always need declarations. Sometimes silence is the most peaceful line you can draw. Even so, I didn't shut the door on them completely. I just stepped far enough back to breathe my own air for once. What surprised me most were the people who stepped forward as the noise fell away. Mr. Willard, the CFO, began checking in, not with advice but with reassurance that my father's trust in me was not misplaced. A few warehouse workers sent simple notes thanking me for recognizing the parts of the company most people ignored. And there was the woman who ran the corner cafe near my new home, who began setting aside a blueberry muffin for me each morning without being asked. These weren't grand gestures. They were small threads that wove a new kind of belonging, one born not from blood, but from kindness, freely given. As the humanitarian wing of the company expanded under my leadership, I found myself spending more time at the operational centers my father built in secret. There were supply routes to reroute shelters to support and partnerships to form with people who understood the quiet power of service. Standing in those spaces surrounded by MAPS workers and the low hum of coordination, it became clear why my father had chosen me. Not because I was the youngest, not because he wanted to punish my sisters, but because I could feel the weight of responsibility without letting it harden me. The work gave shape to my days, purpose gave warmth to my evenings. One afternoon, months after the confrontation, I visited the house again after a long day at the office. The renovations were nearly complete by then. The windows were clean, the paint fresh, the floors gleaming faintly in the late sunlight. I opened all the windows and let the breeze move through the rooms. It carried the scent of new wood and blooming gardens from the street below. I stood in the doorway of what would become my home office, a small space overlooking the backyard, quiet and bright. It felt fitting to place my father's journal there, next to the black phone that had once seemed like a cruel joke. Now it sat on my desk as a reminder of the beginning and the journey since. Its screen was dark, but in a way that felt peaceful, not ominous. Some doors open only once, and that is enough. That evening, as the light faded and the house settled into its new warmth, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, watching the first stars appear. For the first time since I was a child, I felt entirely present, entirely enough, entirely mine. I used to think healing was something loud, something triumphant or visible, but as I sat there in the quiet, I realized healing is often the softest shift in the world. The quiet decision to choose peace over chaos, purpose over pain, and self-worth over approval. I didn't rebuild my life to prove my sisters wrong. I rebuilt it to finally live in a truth my father had seen long before I ever did, that strength grows in silence, and purpose grows in the cracks where others thought nothing could take root. And as the night settled around me, I understood something simple and steady. Sometimes the life you were meant to lead begins only after everything else breaks away. The journey ahead was mine, fully, finally mine.